Hi everybody, happy Monday. It's hard to believe, but we are already in week 4 of the semester. I hope things have been going well for you so far. Again, if at any point you've got any questions, you're confused about any of the terms or concepts that we've gone over, or you'd just like to send me anything that you have related to your weekly assignments at this point, definitely let me know. Keep working on completing those and the reading quizzes. You all have been doing a really good job on them so far, and I try to make sure that I give you feedback and a grade on them within a week. If you've got any questions about your score or my feedback, let me know too. One note to have coming up on your radar is that in a few weeks we have your argument diagram, which is one of your first major assignments in the course. The argument diagram involves you looking at an op-ed that's linked at the very front page of Canvas and using the content that we'll talk about next week to unpack and structure the parts of that argument. So do know that that assignment is coming up on the horizon. More details on that assignment, including the rubric and guidelines, are posted on Canvas as well. For this class, I want to get into Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 is the chapter that some folks find to be a little bit more challenging and confusing. So the first 2 chapters are very much about laying out what is an argument and thinking about how critical decision makers assess arguments, different spheres, private, technical, and public spheres, and contexts where people assess and determine whether or not an argument is good. In this chapter, we get into different approaches that assess different styles of argumentation. So a more narrative style or postmodern or feminist style might be seen as different ways that we convey arguments. And these have a lot of different tropes and characteristics of them that I want to unpack a little bit in conjunction with some of the key terms in this class. So one of the major aspects that's talked about is generating sensible arguments. When we think about what makes an argument sensible, the authors tell us that it has good reasons. So, for example, being sensible might mean that the reasons support the appropriate decision makers or sphere where the arguments are happening. So if you're trying to do genetic tests on rats and you're trying to determine if a piece of makeup is safe to use, you might determine using that evidence from the studies that it is safe to use. So you're being sensible by providing data from the studies of those rats that supports the conclusion that the makeup is safe to use. Being sensible might also mean doing something like telling a good story. So a lot of times you might have a friend who has this great story this time that they were out camping and had a lot of fun. And you might remember that story really well, and maybe if they had some sort of point, like you should always have a flashlight when you go camping, that story suddenly became more resonant and memorable to you, and makes you think, oh, I don't want to be like that, I gotta have a flashlight too. That's a sensible argument. It also means that you have to recognize some of the ways that people come from different backgrounds, including men and women who might communicate differently and understand arguments in different ways as it might relate to their lives. So let's talk through some of the aspects that make arguments sensible. So as mentioned, are there good reasons? So are there pieces of evidence and support for an argument that helps show that that argument is particularly effective or compelling? So if you're just making claims, you're saying, the sky is blue, for example. That would be a claim of fact, and you don't necessarily have support to substantiate that claim. It could be nighttime, the sky could not be blue at that point, right? Then your claim doesn't necessarily have good reasons. So good reasons means that you have enough support for your major claims that a decision maker can say, absolutely, I support your claim. So going back to that rat testing example, if you have done those tests and it's determined that the makeup is safe, that's a good reason. But if you haven't done those tests yet and you just say, oh, it's going to be safe, it'll be no problem, somebody who's trying to market that product probably isn't going to say that it's ready to go yet, because that doesn't seem like it has good reasons. One of the major ways that arguments have reasons that are effective is through the usage of logic or logical appeals. So one of the biggest forms of logic that comes from back to authors like Aristotle is this idea of the syllogism. So if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. So for example, the classic one, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The A part is all men are mortal, the B part is Socrates is a man, and then the C part is therefore Socrates is mortal. A equals B, B equals C. So we use a lot of these kinds of appeals a lot. You might say, hot pizza burns the roof of my mouth. I don't like the roof of my mouth being burned. Therefore, I don't eat hot pizza. So those types of strategies of logic are oftentimes used to make compelling arguments. So we might use this to say that certain categories of arguments are correct. If you've had a similar experience with negative hot pizza, you might have hot barbecue that also would be uncomfortable or unpleasant to you. So that's a form of categorical logic that you can use as well. So in addition to that, you have hypothetical logic, where you suggest that something might be true based on your previous experience, and disjunctive logic that suggests one thing being true means that another thing is false. So, for example, my parents are divorced. If I know that I'm visiting with my dad, I know that I'm not visiting with my mom. That's an example of that type of logical appeal. Oftentimes, we use more informal logics as well. So outside of that, things like computer programming and testing are ways that we use logic, like commands that change your font color or add in a hyperlink, are examples of the logic of that being used in a more informal way. We also see that science is a major way that high credibility is given. So a scientific test, or the usage of a scientific method of experimentation, testing, and retesting results, is something that oftentimes is used to support an argument. So for example, what is the science behind that? Is something that you might hear if somebody says, for instance, that genetically modified food is unsafe. So you might try to scrutinize the way that those types of claims might or might not be supported. In addition to that, we see that oftentimes good storytelling, going back to that camp example, can be a really good way to effectively convey arguments. Stories have characters, they have plots, they have progression, they usually have some sort of climax and resolution to the story. Think like any good movie or TV show that you've seen, and that sticks with you and resonates with you and becomes memorable or particularly compelling. Oftentimes, watching a documentary is a really good example, where they might bring in certain historical figures and show them in a way that is particularly persuasive. So a lot of people, for example, watched the Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary and found elements of her characterization as a Supreme Court justice to be particularly persuasive or interesting. We have these approaches, and then we have what we refer to as postmodernism. And postmodernism is a concept that oftentimes is a little bit more difficult to grasp, and I want to unpack a little bit. So if you think about society leading up to around the 1950s or so, that period of time from the Industrial Revolution at this turn of the century until about then was what we would refer to as a more modernist period. And modernism was concerned with things like development, like building houses, by developing new technology. It might mean pursuing things like new military technology and so on. And postmodernism takes a perspective that rather than just developing and building things, that we deconstruct, that we think about things in new and somewhat strange ways. One way of thinking about postmodernism is it's like a collage of different elements of society and culture that kind of mishmash together. One major element of postmodernism is this view that a sort of grand or master narrative, that is, a narrative or a story that tells the whole experience of the world, is not something that we can achieve. So, for example, something like a particular religion might represent parts of knowledge, according to postmodernism, but not necessarily all of knowledge. So postmodernism is critical of a grand sort of narrative or view of the world. Similarly, science is also critiqued by postmodernism, because postmodernism says, yes, but the scientific method has its problems. Maybe there's faulty data. Maybe the study is not particularly effective. So postmodernism is concerned with how these different grand narratives that we use to make sense of the world can compete and conflict with one another. In the context of argumentation, then, postmodernism suggests that we generate arguments in ways that are perhaps new or strange or interesting. So it might mean using things like memes, posting memes in a way that are trying to convey meaning. So if I go on Facebook, I see people talking about mental health, but not directly. They use a meme to do that. and talk about those kinds of issues. That might be an example of postmodernism in argumentation because it's deconstructing or changing the way that we think about arguments. Additionally, we have feminisms. You might hear the word feminism and have a very specific connotation of what that means, but it's important to realize that there are multiple sort of waves and interpretations of feminism. Feminism could be a first wave, very much focused on things like suffrage. It could be a third wave, focused much more on things like international issues. It could be a sort of radical feminism, a trans-inclusive feminism. There are a variety of different forms of feminism that you might think about when you hear that term. But one major argument that comes about in terms of feminist approaches is that the types of arguments that we form might be different. That is, that rather than using the sort of facts with support and so on, or claims that are substantiated in a more kind of rigid fashion, using things like personal testimony and experiences, seeing arguments not in terms of trying to persuade a third party, but in terms of collaborating with another person to reach a solution, as well as thinking about different ways to resolve conflict, oftentimes through a mediator or something like that, are some of the ways that feminist argumentation challenges the way that more traditional or masculine approaches to argumentation happen. So it gives you an alternative way of thinking about arguments because it thinks about them less in terms of generating conflict and sort of structuring arguments through claims and warrants, but instead by thinking about alternative possibilities of structuring arguments through things like testimony. So these different perspectives on arguments, including a postmodernist perspective, a feminist perspective, as well as the usage of different narratives and testimony in supporting arguments, are ways that you can think about this chapter as helping you. A lot of times, we don't necessarily think about arguments as really rigid and structured in the way that the previous chapters have laid out. So this chapter is very much about making sense of the different types of arguments that we develop and understanding how previous concepts of the course can help us inform and understand them in greater detail. That does it for us for today. Let me know if you have any questions, and happy rest of your week.